Hey guys, it's Christa Watson here, and I'm excited to welcome you to part 4 of Blooming Wallflowers Quilt Along. In this section, I'm going to teach you how I piece together a fun, scrappy quilt back made from leftovers. Some of them were leftovers from the front of the quilt, and I combined them with other odds and ends to make this really fun pieced back. Now, you might be able to see the quilt top shadowing underneath it. That's because I actually build it on the design wall. I put the quilt top up first, and then I grab all my odds and ends, and I kind of puzzle it together to create a unique composition. Each piece backing I make is totally unique and so much fun to sew. In fact, a lot of times I end up liking the backs just as much as the fronts. Now, you don't have to make a piece backing. You can follow along with the Blooming Wallflowers quilt pattern and just make the backing from all one fabric. However, if you want to join me on this adventure, let's dive in and see how I did it. So the first thing I like to do is sew together any smaller bits that were left over from cutting. To keep track of which direction I'm sewing, I placed a few pins and then flipped the strips as I went, so that reverses the sewing direction each time. This prevents the long strips from warping or bowing out of shape. When sewing together the leftovers, I like to group them roughly by size. I cut leftover fat quarters into random strip widths, which I'll sew together first, since they are all about the same length. Now, your leftovers may look a little different than mine depending on how you cut yours out. I may have more or fewer scraps than you do, but that's totally fine. These created a big block from all those leftover strips. I had a few leftover triangles too, so I joined those together randomly into square blocks and rectangles of the same length. I paired these up with some of the background fabric that I cut into squares of the same size. I laid out all of these units into an interesting composition that was roughly the same width of the strip block that I just made. Now, don't overthink it. When it comes to math, I don't really calculate or try to figure it all out ahead of time. I just sew pieces together and I trim everything to fit as I go. Placing these larger pieced panels side by side, you can see that they will work nicely together. Now, I'm going to need to add extra fabric on both sides of my first pieced panel so that it covers the entire width of the quilt, plus a little bit extra. Now it's time to pair this up with some other leftover chunks and hunks of fabric in similar colors. I love getting comfy cozy in my PJs while I sew, and I'm laying out all of the pieces to cover the quilt top. But I'm also thinking about how I can sew these into pairs of roughly the same size. I don't want to deal with any partial seams here, just easy sewing. Once the quilt top is entirely covered with these pieces, I can start joining the individual sections. This is my puzzle method where I take smaller pieces and join them to larger pieces. I'll press and trim each fabric to be the same length as the piece I'm sewing it to. This will prevent the back from getting all wonky and out of shape. Once each panel section is sewn, I'll place them over the quilt top again to ensure that I still have good coverage. If there's a gap, I'm just going to grab more fabric and add another pieced section. I try to place larger chunks of fabric around the edges since those will get trimmed up the most. For my quilt back, I join the bottom sections together first and then the top sections. It's okay if the outside edges aren't perfectly straight since those are going to all get trimmed away later. Now I'll grab the bottom two panels, pin those, and sew those together. Then it's back on the design wall and it's time to join the top half of the quilt back to the bottom half. I'm pinning as I go and making sure that they are roughly the same length. Now this is the very last seam I have to sew, and it's a lot of bulk to deal with. So you'll see me constantly adjusting the piece as I sew, trying to keep those edges even. Pressing the seams open and sewing with a shorter stitch length helps everything fit together nicely. Because my name is on all of the fabrics I design, I like to piece in selvages just for fun. It's kind of a vanity thing, but it's also my cheater way of signing my own quilts. Now the piece back is done, and you can see the top shadowing through underneath, showing that I made it big enough. Well, I'm really pleased with how my pieced backing turned out. You'll notice it's bigger than the quilt top itself by about 5 to 6 inches all the way around all 4 sides. That's going to make it a lot easier when it comes time to basting the quilt. So go ahead and make your back so we can get ready for basting next time. I will see you then. And if you need any supplies, please be sure to visit me at shop.christaquilts.com. I'm excited to cheer you on as you make your blooming Wallflowers quilt.